The roar of 12 Harley-Davidson motorcycles echoed through my quiet suburban neighborhood at 7 in the morning. I watched from my kitchen window as Corinne's face went from confusion to absolute horror. She stood frozen in her pristine robe, coffee mug trembling in her hands, as a dozen leather-clad bikers filed through the electronic gate into what she thought was her private domain. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The same woman who had dismissed my concerns just weeks earlier was now experiencing the exact violation she had inflicted on me. The irony was perfect. She had established the rules of this game when she gave my gate code to her party guests without permission. She had turned my private sanctuary into a public playground. Now it was my turn to share access with strangers. That moment when she realized what I had done, that was when Corinne finally understood the monster she had created. My name is David, and I spent 3 years turning my backyard into paradise. Every weekend, every vacation day, every spare dollar went into creating something special. The raised garden beds filled with heirloom tomatoes and herbs. The stone pathway I laid by hand, each piece carefully chosen and placed. The outdoor kitchen with its built-in grill and granite countertops that cost more than my first car. But the crown jewel was the electronic gate system. It was not just about security, though that mattered in our neighborhood. It was about peace, about having one place in this world where I could exist without interruption, without surprise visitors, without the chaos of modern life creeping in. The gate was my barrier between the world and my sanctuary. The installation took 2 weeks and cost $8,000. Biometric scanner, smartphone app, emergency backup codes, the works. When the technician handed me the master code, I felt like I was holding the key to my own private kingdom. Corinne moved in next door about 6 months later. She seemed nice enough at first. Blonde hair always perfectly styled, designer workout clothes, driving a white Range Rover that probably cost more than most people make in a year. She brought homemade cookies on moving day and complimented my garden with what seemed like genuine appreciation. The first few months were pleasant. We exchanged pleasantries over the fence, borrowed the occasional tool, talked about neighborhood happenings. Corinne had opinions about everything, but I chalked that up to being new and wanting to fit in. Everyone has their quirks, right? The gate code sharing happened during one of these fence conversations in late spring. Corinne was asking about my security system, saying she was thinking about upgrading her own. The conversation naturally drifted to emergency situations. What would happen if there was a fire or medical emergency, and first responders needed access? You know, it would be smart for neighbors to have each other's access codes, she said, twirling a strand of hair around her finger. Just for emergencies, of course. We have to look out for each other. It made sense. I had been thinking the same thing, so I shared the code, making it clear this was strictly for emergencies. Corinne nodded enthusiastically, promising to guard it like her own family secrets. Looking back, I should have noticed the signs earlier. The way she tested boundaries in small ways, asking to borrow things without returning them promptly, making comments about how neighborhood spaces should be more communal, dropping hints about how my backyard would be perfect for entertaining. But I was naive. I believed in good neighbors and community trust. I thought we were building the kind of relationship that makes suburban life worth living. I had no idea that I had just handed the key to my sanctuary to someone who viewed other people's property as an extension of her own personal playground. Someone who would take my trust and turn it into a weapon against me. The backyard had taken 3 years to build, but it would take Corinne less than 3 months to show me exactly what she thought of my boundaries. I returned from my weekend camping trip Sunday evening feeling refreshed and ready for the week ahead. The moment I pulled into my driveway, I knew something was wrong. There were tire tracks in my carefully maintained grass, leading directly to my backyard gate. My heart sank as I approached the electronic gate. It was slightly ajar, which should have been impossible since it was designed to close automatically. The motion sensors were working, the power was on, but somehow the gate had been left open. I punched in my code and stepped into what used to be my sanctuary. The scene before me was devastating. My outdoor furniture had been moved and rearranged, with several pieces noticeably damaged. The cushions on my expensive patio set were stained with what looked like beer and barbecue sauce. My fire pit area was overflowing with empty bottles, food containers, and cigarette butts. Someone had used my garden hose to wash dishes, leaving a muddy mess across my stone pathway. But the worst part was my garden. 3 years of careful cultivation destroyed in a single night. My prize-winning tomato plants had been trampled, their stakes broken and fruit scattered across the ground. The herb garden I had nurtured from seeds was flattened, leaving only broken stems and wilted leaves. Someone had even used my raised beds as improvised trash cans, leaving empty cans and bottles among the ruined plants. I stood there in shock, trying to process what I was seeing. This was not random vandalism. This was deliberate use of my property by people who knew they had access, people who had been given permission to be here. The security footage confirmed my worst fears. Karen had hosted a party Saturday night, and when her own backyard became too crowded, she had simply opened my gate and directed her guests to make themselves at home in my space. I watched in horror as 20-plus strangers wandered through my sanctuary, treating it like a public park. The footage showed Karen herself giving a tour to some guests, pointing out my expensive outdoor kitchen and laughing about something I could not hear. She was playing hostess with my property, acting like she owned the place. The casual way she directed people to help themselves to my space made my blood boil. I marched straight to Karen's front door and rang the doorbell repeatedly until she answered. She appeared completely calm, still wearing her party dress from the night before, not a care in the world. "David, what a pleasant surprise," she said with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "How was your camping trip?" "Karen, what the hell happened in my backyard?" Her expression shifted to one of mild annoyance, like I was bothering her with trivial concerns. "Oh, that. My party got a little bigger than expected, so I just opened your gate to give everyone more space. No big deal." "No big deal." I could barely contain my rage. "You destroyed my garden. You let strangers trash my property. You had no right to give anyone access to my yard." Karen rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. "Come on, David. It is just a backyard. We are neighbors. What is mine is yours. What is yours is mine, right? That is how communities work." "That is not how property rights work, Karen. You violated my trust and destroyed thousands of dollars worth of landscaping." "Look, I will pay for any real damage," she said dismissively. "But you are overreacting. A few plants can be replaced. You should be happy that your space got some use instead of just sitting there empty." I stared at her in disbelief. She genuinely could not understand why what she had done was wrong. In her mind, my property was an extension of her entertainment options, available for her use whenever convenient. "Karen, you cannot just decide to use other people's property without permission. That code was for emergencies only." "And I used my judgment about what constituted an emergency," she replied with a shrug. "My guests needed more space. Problem solved." That conversation changed everything. I realized I was not dealing with a thoughtless neighbor who had made a mistake. I was dealing with someone who fundamentally believed that other people's property existed for her convenience. Someone who would never respect boundaries because she did not believe boundaries applied to her. The damage to my backyard could be repaired, but the damage to my sense of security and privacy felt permanent. Corinne had taken something precious from me and treated it like garbage, and she felt completely justified in doing so. Monday morning, I started documenting everything. Photos of every damaged plant, every stained cushion, every piece of trash left behind. I created a detailed inventory with replacement costs, which quickly added up to over $3,000 in damages. The rare heirloom tomato plants alone would cost hundreds to replace, assuming I could even find the same varieties. My first call was to the police. The desk sergeant listened politely to my complaint about trespassing and property damage, but his response was immediate and deflating. "Did you give this person permission to access your property?" he asked. "I gave her the gate code for emergencies only." "But you did give her the code voluntarily." "Yes, but not for this purpose." "Sir, this sounds like a civil matter. You might want to contact your HOA or consider small claims court." The HOA was my next stop. I filled out the complaint forms, attached my photos and damage estimates, and submitted everything through their online portal. Within 48 hours, I received a response that was worse than useless. "After reviewing your complaint, we find that this appears to be a neighbor dispute rather than an HOA violation. We encourage residents to work out their differences amicably. If you believe criminal activity has occurred, please contact local law enforcement." I called the HOA office directly and spoke to the property manager, Mrs. Henderson. She was sympathetic but firm. "Mr. Davis, I understand your frustration, but Corinne has not violated any HOA rules. She did not host the party on common property or violate any noise ordinances. The fact that guests accessed your property with a code you provided makes this a private matter between neighbors. So there are no consequences for someone destroying another resident's property. If you can prove intentional destruction, that would be a matter for the courts, not the HOA." The courts were my next avenue. I consulted with a local attorney who specialized in property disputes. After reviewing my evidence, his assessment was brutally honest. "You have a case, but it is complicated by the fact that you voluntarily shared the access code. Corinne can argue that she had implied permission to use the space. Even if you win, you are looking at months of litigation for maybe a few $1,000s in damages. The legal fees alone could exceed what you would recover." While I was dealing with the bureaucratic nightmare, Corinne was doubling down on her behavior. She started using my gate code for daily convenience, cutting through my backyard when walking her dog because it was shorter than going around the block. When I confronted her about this, she acted like I was being unreasonable. "It is just a shortcut, David. You are not even home during the day. What is the harm?" She began hosting regular small gatherings in her backyard, and inevitably some guests would wander into my space. Each time, Corinne would apologize insincerely and promise it would not happen again, but it always did. The pattern became clear. Corinne had learned that there were no real consequences for her actions. The police would not get involved. The HOA would not act. The courts were too expensive and time-consuming. She could do whatever she wanted with impunity. My research into local trespassing laws revealed the cruel irony of the situation. By voluntarily sharing my gate code, I had essentially granted Corinne a form of permission that was difficult to revoke legally. even though I had specified it was for emergencies only. Proving misuse would require expensive litigation with uncertain outcomes. Every official channel I tried led to the same dead end. The system that was supposed to protect property rights had loopholes big enough to drive a Range Rover through. Karen had found those loopholes and was exploiting them with increasing boldness. The stress was affecting my sleep, my work, my entire quality of life. The backyard that had once been my peaceful retreat now felt like a constant source of anxiety. I found myself checking the security cameras obsessively, waiting for the next violation. Something had to give. If the official channels would not protect my rights, I would have to find another way. Karen had taught me that conventional rules did not apply to our situation. It was time for me to learn that lesson and apply it creatively. The solution, when it came to me, would use Karen's own logic against her in the most poetic way possible. The inspiration struck me on a Thursday morning while I was driving to work. I had stopped at a red light when I noticed them in the parking lot of the diner across the street. About a dozen motorcycles lined up in perfect formation, their chrome gleaming in the morning sun. The Riverside Riders, our local motorcycle club. I had seen them around town for years but never really paid attention. They were not the stereotypical outlaw bikers from movies. These were mostly middle-aged guys with day jobs who rode together on weekends. Mechanics, construction workers, a few small business owners. They kept to themselves, supported local charities, and generally minded their own business. But they were intimidating. There was no denying that. Something about the leather jackets, the massive bikes, the way they carried themselves with quiet confidence. They commanded respect without saying a word. That was when the idea hit me like a lightning bolt. If Karen could share my gate code with strangers, why could I not do the same? She had established the precedent that my access code was community property, available for sharing with anyone who might find it useful. I spent the next few days researching the Riverside Riders. What I found made my plan even more perfect. They were not criminals or troublemakers. They were working-class guys who had formed a brotherhood around their love of motorcycles and their commitment to looking out for each other. They had a reputation for being protective of their community and not tolerating disrespect. Perfect. The moral justification came easier than I expected. Karen had repeatedly argued that property should be shared among neighbors, that private spaces were selfish when they could serve the community. She had dismissed my concerns about boundaries and consent, insisting that her needs trumped my property rights. Well, if that was the rule she wanted to play by, I was happy to accommodate her. I began observing Karen's patterns more carefully. She hosted gatherings every other weekend, usually starting around 6 on Saturday evenings. She always did her shopping Friday afternoons, leaving her house empty for several hours. She walked her dog every morning at 8:30, rain or shine. The reconnaissance phase felt like planning a military operation. I noted which days she seemed most stressed, which times she was most likely to be home alone, when she would have the maximum audience for what was about to unfold. I also confirmed that the bikers had their weekly meeting every Saturday morning at 9 at the diner. They would spend about an hour there, drinking coffee and planning their weekend rides. It was a perfect opportunity to approach them when they were all together but not yet committed to other plans. The beauty of my plan was its simplicity and its perfect mirror logic. Karen had argued that sharing access codes was neighborly behavior. She had insisted that private property should serve community needs. She had dismissed my concerns about consent and boundaries. Now she would get to experience her own philosophy in action. I practiced my approach to the bikers multiple times. I needed to present the situation in a way that would appeal to their sense of justice, without making them feel like they were being used as instruments of revenge. They had to understand that they were not doing anything wrong, just accepting access that was being freely offered according to precedent Corinne herself had established. The final piece of preparation was confirming that my gate code still worked and that Corinne had not changed anything about her own security setup. Everything was exactly as it had been. She had grown so comfortable with the status quo that she had stopped being cautious. On Friday night, I barely slept. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, poetic in its justice, and completely legal according to the rules Corinne had established. She had spent months teaching me that traditional boundaries did not apply to our relationship. Tomorrow, she would learn what that lesson looked like from the other side. I thought about all the official channels that had failed me, the police who would not act, the HOA that would not intervene, the legal system that was too expensive and uncertain. All of them had essentially told me that I was on my own, that I needed to find a way to coexist with Corinne's behavior. Fine, I would coexist, on my terms using her rules. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather. Clear skies, mild temperature, no wind. The kind of day that was perfect for motorcycle riding. The kind of day that would make my new friends eager to accept an invitation to explore new territory. It was time to give Corinne exactly what she had asked for. Saturday morning at 8:45, I walked into the Riverside Diner with my heart pounding but my resolve absolutely solid. The bikers were exactly where I expected them to be, occupying the large corner booth and two adjacent tables. Coffee cups, plates of eggs and bacon, and the easy conversation of men who had known each other for years. I approached their table with the confidence of someone who had practiced this moment dozens of times in my head. The conversation gradually died as they noticed me walking over. "Excuse me, gentlemen," I said, addressing the obvious leader, a stocky man with graying hair and kind eyes. "My name is David Chen. I live over on Riverside Drive and I have a proposition that might interest you." The leader, who introduced himself as Mike, gestured to an empty chair. "Have a seat, David. What can we do for you?" I sat down and looked around the table at faces that ranged from curious to skeptical. These were not men who were easily impressed or manipulated. I needed to be straightforward and honest. "I have a situation with a neighbor who believes that private property should be shared with the community. She has established a precedent of giving my gate access code to strangers so they can use my private backyard for their convenience. I thought you might appreciate having the same access." Mike raised an eyebrow. "What kind of access are we talking about?" "Electronic gate access to a private backyard with outdoor kitchen facilities, seating areas, and plenty of parking. My neighbor has made it clear that she considers sharing access codes to be normal neighborly behavior. I am simply following her lead." The men exchanged glances. One of them, a tall guy with a beard, leaned forward. "This sounds like there is more to the story." I spent the next 10 minutes explaining the situation. Corinne's party, the damage to my property, her continued violations, and the complete failure of official channels to provide any remedy. I was careful to emphasize that I was not asking them to do anything illegal or harmful. I was simply offering them the same courtesy that Corinne had extended to her own guests. "So you want us to just show up and use this woman's backyard?" Mike asked. "Actually, the access code I am sharing leads to my backyard. But Corinne has established that neighbors in our community share access freely. She has used my space dozens of times. I am sure she will be delighted to know that I have embraced her philosophy of community property sharing. The understanding dawned on their faces simultaneously. Several of them began to smile. This was not just about access to a backyard. This was about justice, poetic and perfect. "When were you thinking of testing out this community access?" Mike asked with a grin. "Well, Corinne typically starts her day with coffee on her patio around 7 on Saturday mornings. She likes to enjoy the peaceful morning hours in her backyard. I thought that might be a perfect time for the community to begin utilizing the shared space." The laughter around the table was low and appreciative. These men understood exactly what I was proposing and why it was brilliant. "We usually start our Saturday rides around 10, Mike said thoughtfully. "But I suppose we could adjust our schedule to accommodate this community access opportunity." "That would be wonderful. The gate code is 47892. The address is 1247 Riverside Drive. There is plenty of room for parking, and the outdoor kitchen is fully equipped if anyone wants coffee." Mike wrote down the information carefully. "David, I want to be clear about something. We are not going to damage any property or cause any real problems. We are just going to exercise our community access rights as established by your neighbor. That is all I am asking for. Corinne has made it very clear that private property should serve community needs. I am sure she will be thrilled to see her philosophy put into practice." We shook hands all around. The bikers were clearly excited about the prospect of using their Saturday morning to teach someone about the consequences of their own actions. Justice was about to be served with a side of motorcycle exhaust. I drove home with my hands shaking slightly from adrenaline. The plan was in motion, and there was no turning back. In less than 10 hours, Corinne would wake up to discover what community property sharing actually looked like when applied consistently. I spent the rest of Friday evening and early Saturday morning making sure everything was perfect. The gate was functioning properly, the security cameras were recording, and I had a perfect view of both my backyard and Corinne's patio from my kitchen window. At 6:55 Saturday morning, I made coffee and positioned myself at the window. Corinne appeared on schedule, settling into her patio chair with her morning coffee and what looked like a magazine. She was wearing her expensive silk robe and appeared completely relaxed, ready to enjoy another peaceful morning in her private domain. At exactly 7 o'clock, the rumble of 12 motorcycle engines shattered the morning silence. Corinne's head snapped up from her magazine, confusion evident on her face. The rumble grew louder, then stopped abruptly in front of my house. Corinne stood up, trying to see over the fence. That was when she heard the electronic beep of my gate opening and the sound of footsteps on my stone pathway. Her expression changed from confusion to alarm to absolute horror as 12 leather-clad bikers filed through the gate into what she had considered her sphere of influence. They were not threatening or aggressive. They were simply men exercising their community access rights, exactly as Corinne had established was appropriate behavior. The look on her face was worth every moment of stress she had caused me. Finally, Corinne was learning what it felt like to have strangers appear in her private space without warning or permission. The lesson had begun. Corinne's reaction was everything I had hoped for and more. She stood frozen on her patio for a full 30 seconds, watching as the bikers made themselves comfortable in my backyard. When she finally found her voice, it came out as a strangled shout. "What the hell is going on over there?" The bikers ignored her completely. They were busy exploring their new community space, admiring the outdoor kitchen, and commenting appreciatively on the stonework. Mike fired up the grill and started making coffee for the group. A few others examined my tool shed with professional interest. They were behaving exactly like Corinne's party guests had, treating the space as if they owned it. Within minutes, Corinne was at my front door, pounding with both fists. I took my time answering, making sure to bring my coffee cup to complete the picture of casual morning relaxation. "David, what the hell are those people doing in your backyard?" "Oh, those are my new friends from the Riverside Riders. I shared the gate code with them, just like you shared it with your party guests. They are exploring the community property." Corinne's face went through several shades of red. "Community property, that is your backyard." "Exactly the same way it was my backyard when you let 20 strangers use it for your party. You taught me that neighbors share access codes and property. I am just following your example." "That was completely different." "How was it different, Corinne? You gave strangers access to my private property without my permission. I gave access to my private property to people I chose. The only difference is that I asked permission first." She was sputtering now, trying to find an argument that would not immediately expose her hypocrisy. "Those people are intimidating. They do not belong in this neighborhood. They are tax-paying citizens exercising their community access rights, just like your party guests did. Are you saying that some strangers are more deserving of access than others?" The bikers had made themselves completely at home. They were not being destructive or threatening, but their presence was overwhelming. 12 large men in leather jackets, with their massive motorcycles parked in front of my house, created an atmosphere that Corinne clearly found terrifying. "Make them leave, David. This is harassment." "I cannot make them leave, Corinne. You established that sharing access codes means people can use the space as they see fit. That is exactly what they are doing." Over the next few days, the bikers established a regular presence. They would stop by for coffee before their rides, use the space for impromptu meetings, and generally treat my backyard like their clubhouse. They were always respectful of my property and never caused any damage, but their presence was constant and unmistakable. Corinne tried everything to regain control of the situation. She called the police, who gave her the same response I had received. "The property owner has shared access codes with these individuals. This appears to be a civil matter." She contacted the HOA, who reminded her that the bikers were not violating any community rules by accessing private property with the owner's permission. She even tried to change the locks on her own gates, but that backfired spectacularly. The bikers technically had access to my property, which meant they could use my driveway and walkways. Corinne's attempt to block access only made their presence more prominent as they had to park on the street and walk through the front yard. The community reaction was mixed but largely supportive of my position. Word spread quickly about what had happened and why. Most neighbors admitted they had heard about Corinne's party behavior and were not surprised that it had finally caused problems. Several people confided that they had their own issues with Corinne's entitled attitude. Mrs. Rodriguez from across the street stopped by to tell me she thought the whole thing was brilliant. "That woman needed to learn about consequences," she said. "Maybe now she will think twice before assuming other people's property is hers to use." But the real genius of the situation was watching Corinne experience exactly what she had put me through. The constant anxiety about when strangers might appear on her property. The feeling of violation and helplessness. The frustration of official channels that could not or would not help. She started avoiding her backyard entirely, staying inside when the bikers were around. Her morning coffee routine disappeared. She stopped hosting gatherings because she could not guarantee privacy for her guests. The outdoor space that had been her pride and joy became a source of stress and embarrassment. The irony was perfect and daily. Karen had argued that private property should serve community needs. Now the community was serving itself, and she hated every minute of it. She had dismissed my concerns about boundaries and consent. Now she was living without boundaries or consent, and it was driving her crazy. After 2 weeks of this, Karen was ready to negotiate. But the bikers were not going anywhere until she learned to respect other people's property rights. The education was far from over. 3 weeks into the biker occupation, Karen finally broke. She appeared at my door on a Tuesday evening, looking exhausted and defeated. The woman who had once dismissed my concerns with casual arrogance now seemed small and fragile. "David, we need to talk." I invited her in and offered coffee, which she accepted gratefully. We sat at my kitchen table, and for the first time since this whole mess started, Karen looked me directly in the eyes. "I understand what you are trying to teach me," she said quietly. "I get it. I violated your property and your trust, and I dismissed your concerns when you tried to address it reasonably." "Go on." "I was wrong. I was completely, absolutely wrong. I had no right to give anyone access to your property, and I had no right to treat your concerns like they did not matter." Her voice was shaking slightly. "I am sorry, David. I am genuinely sorry for what I did and how I acted afterward." It was the first real apology I had heard from her, and it sounded sincere. But I needed more than words. "What are you proposing, Karen?" "I want to make this right. I will pay for all the damage from the party, including replacement costs for your plants. I will never use your gate code again except for genuine emergencies, and I will respect your property boundaries going forward. And in return, I am hoping you will consider asking your friends to find a different place for their community activities." I pretended to consider this carefully, though I had already planned this conversation. "I will need to talk to them, but I think they might be willing to move on if they felt the lesson had been learned." The lesson has definitely been learned. That weekend, I met with Mike and the other bikers at the diner. I explained Karen's apology and her commitment to changing her behavior. They were satisfied that justice had been served and agreed to gracefully withdraw from the situation. She needed to understand what it feels like to have her space invaded by strangers, Mike said. Sounds like she figured it out. The following Monday, I changed my gate code and gave Karen the new one with a clear understanding that it was strictly for emergencies. She nodded eagerly and promised to guard it appropriately. True to her word, Karen's behavior changed completely. She stopped cutting through my property, stopped assuming access to my space, and started treating property boundaries with the respect they deserved. When she hosted gatherings, she made sure they stayed on her own property and ended at reasonable hours. The community dynamics improved as well. Word had spread about how the situation was resolved, and several neighbors told me they appreciated seeing someone stand up to entitled behavior. Karen's reputation had taken a hit, but she was working to rebuild it through respectful behavior rather than demands and assumptions. Most importantly, I had my sanctuary back. The backyard once again became a place of peace and privacy, protected by boundaries that were now clearly understood and respected by everyone involved. The whole experience taught me that sometimes official channels fail, and when they do, creative solutions can be more effective than conventional ones. Karen had established rules that dismissed property rights and personal boundaries. I simply applied those same rules consistently until she understood why they were problematic. Justice does not always come through courts and authorities. Sometimes it comes through giving people exactly what they ask for, applied with perfect consistency. Corinne wanted community property sharing. She got it. She wanted strangers to have access to private spaces. She experienced it. She wanted boundaries to be flexible and consent to be optional. She lived without both until she begged for their return. The lesson was simple but profound. Respect other people's property and boundaries, or lose the protection of your own. Corinne learned it the hard way, but she learned it permanently, and our neighborhood became a better place because of it.